Hello, everybody. So this is our first video for our class that I'm going to be making and posting. We'll just go ahead and start right where I left off in class last week before all this craziness kind of descended upon us. So where we left off, we were talking about the kind of Herculean efforts that Lyndon Johnson engaged in to secure passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Which is generally considered to be the most significant civil rights law passed in the 20th century, which banned discrimination in education and public accommodation on the basis of gender, um, and pretty much every, you know, public area of American life. It notably at the time did not include housing discrimination, though that would be a topic that would be addressed later in the civil rights movement. Um, but in spite of the fact that Johnson had succeeded in 1964 in overcoming the Southern filibuster that had lasted for over 70 days, launched by Senator James Eastland of Mississippi, Johnson was rightly worried about his political prospects in the 1964 election, particularly given the reliance the Democratic Party had at the time on the votes of Southern, oftentimes segregationist voters in those deep South states like Mississippi and Louisiana, etc. He famously said upon signing the law, "We've lost the South for a generation." Um, that estimate actually, it turns out, would prove to be in the long run optimistic. But we'll get into that later. But anyway, so Johnson was fearful that he might lose the election of 1964. In the end, however, he ends up winning the election by the largest landslide in American history, winning over 61% of the popular vote, the largest vote share of any presidential candidate in an election in American history. So the question now, of course, is how did he do that? How did he manage to, in spite of the fact that many in the South considered him a traitor to his race and to his party by supporting civil rights, how did he manage to win the largest landslide in American political history in spite of the defection of many white Southerners from the Democratic Party? Well, the principal answer for that is actually one that also provides us a window into the future direction of American politics. Uh, Johnson's eventual adversary in the 1964 election, Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was an Arizona senator who represented a new and upcoming, and at the time, what was seen as extreme brand of conservatism in the United States. Goldwater, along with other groups that adhered to his philosophy, like William F. Buckley, the publisher of the National Review, and the youth group that he founded, the Young Americans for Freedom, which would eventually number over 50,000 activists active on thousands of college campuses. In fact, there were more conservative activists active on college campuses in the United States in the 1960s than there were left-wing activists, contrary to the popular depiction of the time period. It just happens that the left-wing anti-war activists, in many cases, were louder and, well, better at organizing their protests in a way that was very dramatic than their conservative counterparts. In the long run, this would actually prove to be a massive liability for those left-wing movements, whereas the generally quiet nature of how conservative movements organized on campuses and beyond proved to be, in the long run, an asset. But in the short run, basically, Goldwater represented a new breed of Republican. Remember that during the 1950s, the Republican Party had largely abandoned the laissez-faire, anti-government philosophy that had been a mainstay in the party since the early 20th century, at least since the defeat of Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, if not before that. Um, But during the Eisenhower administration, the Republican Party had largely embraced a more moderate brand of republicanism, one that didn't take strong stances on social issues like civil rights, one that accepted at least some level of government interference, and basically accepted the status quo of government intervention that had been established by the New Deal in the 1930s. Um, that brand of republicanism, which was sometimes referred to occasionally with considerable derision as the Eastern establishment brand of republicanism, had helped Dwight Eisenhower secure 2 terms in office. But by 1964, the Eastern establishment wing of the Republican Party, that was oftentimes more fiscally conservative but still fairly socially liberal on issues like civil rights, was increasingly on the outs as more socially conservative and economically conservative, even more economically conservative groups began multiplying and exerting a greater influence on the party. These groups fundamentally rejected many key aspects of the liberalism of the Kennedy and Johnson administration, and can be seen fundamentally in this sense as reactionary in many ways. They were reacting against the civil rights movement and what they saw as the invasion of states' rights through laws that required desegregation and equal access to public accommodation, amongst other things, as well as calling for desegregation of schools and things like that. They were opposed to the regulatory regime in American business and finance that the New Deal had normalized during the Great Depression, and they were staunchly and aggressively anti-communist. They favored a much more aggressive way of dealing with the Soviet Union than the containment strategy that had been adopted by pretty much all American presidents since Harry Truman, including Harry Truman himself, of course, and favored, not precluding the use of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. They favored physical confrontation with the Soviet Union rather than the use of economic programs, the exportation of New Deal style social democracy, basically, that have been championed by Johnson and Kennedy before him. And so there's this new breed of Republican that emerges. And in 1964, they finally find a candidate in Barry Goldwater. Goldwater ultimately embraces many aspects of this. He is against federal intervention in civil rights, claiming again states' rights and freedom of interaction, freedom of association, basically. And he's also against expansive government programs, even including very popular ones like Social Security. He's also, again, a very strident Cold Warrior who supports expanding American nuclear weapons, launching potential first strikes against the Soviet Union, and not simply abiding by the containment doctrine. Another aspect of this that they are in reaction to is the rulings of the Supreme Court. In addition to reacting against the successes of the civil rights movement, various social programs that Johnson enacts early in 1964, such as his War on Poverty initiatives, which I'll be discussing in a later video here in a little bit. The Goldwater also, in addition to reacting against all of those things, also reacted against what many saw as the activist bend of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had, since the appointment of Earl Warren in 1953, issued a broad range of sweeping decisions that transformed many areas of American life, oftentimes by explicitly citing the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Brown decision, which in and of itself Goldwater and many other conservatives at that point still refused to abide by or recognize. There were also decisions in areas of criminal justice, such as the Miranda v. Arizona decision, which requires the police read people their rights at the time that they are first detained and at the time of arrest. There's the Gideon v. Wainwright decision from a few years before that, which establishes that even in state trials, people are guaranteed the right to counsel, and that states have to provide counsel to people even if they cannot afford to pay for counsel themselves. Um, there's also rulings in areas like school prayer, the Ingle v. Vitale decision, which outlawed an explicitly Christian prayer in New York, and Abington School District v. Shimp, which further clarified that and established clear prohibitions against state-sponsored prayer in the schools, which the court saw, and which many since have come to agree with, what represented a clear violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of a religion. Basically, the court found that these, public school sponsored prayers were in effect a state endorsement of a particular religion, which again clearly goes against the grain of the First Amendment. So there's that. And then there's, again, the support for civil rights. The Warren Court, in addition to the Brown decision, had issued a number of decisions expanding the boundaries of civil rights throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. And they became, in and of themselves, an object of scorn. People began putting bumper stickers on their cars saying "Impeach Earl Warren" because of the unpopularity of many of the court's decisions regarding integration and civil rights. So, there's all these various streams that kind of come together and intersect in 1964. The growing resistance against what many come to see as an intrusive federal role in regulating business, what they see as a weak response to the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and a favoring of a more progressive, a more aggressive prosecuting of that conflict. Reaction against, the Supreme Court decisions of the Warren Court, and of course, most notably, a reaction against civil rights. Now, in the end, this proves to be a godsend for Johnson at the time, because, again, Goldwater said a couple of things that, people may have agreed with a lot of his basic rhetoric, but there were a few things he said that raised eyebrows at the time, such as him threatening to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam to bring a decisive end to that growing conflict, which the U.S. was finding itself more and more deeply intertwined with. There's the fact that he threatened to get rid of Social Security, which by this point was, and to this day remains, a very popular social program in the United States. So he scared a lot of people with what many saw as his irresponsible Cold War rhetoric. And he also alienated a lot of seniors by threatening to take away what many saw as a key benefits program. So in the end, Johnson, who, as I mentioned previously, is perhaps the most skilled politician in modern American history, he was able to very skillfully play off of these things. Most famously in this devastating political campaign ad that he produces called the Daisy ad, which I'm going to try to post a link to here in a little bit, because it's extremely blunted but extremely effective. It basically shows a young girl picking a flower, a daisy is the presumption, and then it proceeds to a countdown that culminates in a nuclear blast. So its message is very blunt but very effective. So ultimately, in spite of the defection of a sizable number of Southern voters in the Deep South, in places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, etc., and certain segments of the working class white population in the North, Johnson manages to be able to not only hold together the Democratic coalition, but is able to actually attract many moderate Republicans who were turned off by Goldwater's abrasive rhetoric and his policies, which they didn't agree with, either social or economic policies. And so he's able to win this massive landslide, carrying 61% of the popular vote and winning all but 6 states in the election of 1964. So, from at the time, people saw this as a definitive repudiation of the kind of new right conservatism that Goldwater and William F. Buckley and other conservative intellectuals at the time embraced. But in reality, it actually serves as a foreshadowing of a massive shift in American politics that is going to come only 4 years later, when Johnson is on the outs because of his missteps in Vietnam, and the United States ultimately ends up electing Richard Nixon in the 1968 election. Notably, in 1964, like I said, many of the 6 states that Goldwater carried, including his home state of Arizona, the other 5 were all in the Deep South, and all had previously been Democratic strongholds. So it's an election that, again, provides a victory for Johnson that seemingly offers a massive repudiation of this new brand of politics, but in actuality, it's an election that shows the beginnings of a major political transformation in American society and American politics that, largely because of the increased tempo of the civil rights movement, as well as the controversies that come about as a result of American involvement in the Vietnam War, will ultimately not only gain ascendancy, but will ultimately overtake the dominant American political establishment in very short order. So it's an important election in a lot of ways, but definitely one that's worth paying attention to if you're looking at history and kind of trying to read the tea leaves of where things are going heading forward. So that concludes that aspect of this. So in the next video, what I'm going to look at is kind of the high watermark of liberalism in the United States, kind of the high watermark of liberal reform during this, kind of halcyon period of 1964 and 1965, when there is just an absolutely astounding array of new laws, government policies, and reforms that are enacted, which is then followed up by an exceptionally fierce backlash, a backlash which is partly due to the successes of the civil rights movement, but which also is in large part, again, like so many things that come back on, sort of serving as a repudiation for that sort of activist government that had characterized the early 1960s, a repudiation brought about by the shattering effects of the Vietnam War. So that's where we'll talk about in the next video. So I'm going to go ahead and end that, and we'll start the next video here in a little bit.